Hey everyone, welcome to the last edition of my Unessay. If you haven't seen the first two videos, there are going to be some links in the doobly-doo. I'm going to start with an apology and a correction. Last video I did some speculation on the idea that poetry was the most accessible art form in the Elizabethan era. I didn't really have a whole lot to back up this claim. It was mostly speculation. This week I found myself reading this book called Will in the World by Stephen Greenblatt. The introduction to this book sort of tells me otherwise. He gets his point across in a very constructed and narrated way, but the message is very clear. Theater in the Elizabethan era was extremely popular. Popularity and accessibility isn't completely the same thing, but they are related. So I think the idea of accessibility turned out to be a little bit more complicated than I made it out to be, and I apologize for that. Regardless, I do think this is a very small detail, and my overall argument from my last video still does stand. Poetry and vlogging are functionally very similar. So moving on, today I want to answer two main questions. The first is, why have I bothered to juxtapose poetry and vlogging at all? The short answer to this is to preserve poetry as a relevant literary form in our ever-changing society. Our society is changing really fast, exponentially fast even, and poetry just can't keep up. It's getting left behind. Old media like poetry is getting swept away by new media like Twitter or vlogging to the detriment of the literary world. Maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, but I'm going to explain my reasoning for this through a post-structuralist approach. Post-structuralism is a philosophical position, and it can get really heavy with smart person jargon, so I'm going to try to explain this as straightforwardly as I possibly can for those who are not familiar with it. Structuralism is a philosophy that says our understanding of the world is like an interconnected web of ideas. These ideas are organized by one main idea, what is often called a center. This is a term often used by Jacques Derrida, a champion of post-structuralism. Everything within this web of ideas revolves around the center. A great example of this is patriarchy and sexism. It's this great big web of ideas, preconceptions, stigmas that are all interconnected. The center of patriarchy is this idea that men and women are inherently different. Everything patriarchal stems from this one single assumption. Post-structuralism is a reaction to structuralism. It recognizes the fact that the center that we often take for granted is socially constructed, it's fluid, it's not always constant. As a result, the entire web becomes unstable, it becomes adaptive instead of rigid. More often than not, this is a far better representation of our actual world. Okay, David, that's cool, but what does this have anything to do with anything poetic? Well, poetry has been a mainstay in human culture for thousands of years, and for most of that time, human culture has been relatively stable. Poetry as a form is also stable. What do I mean by that? Well, think about it. Poetry as a form hasn't really changed a whole lot since the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Iliad. For thousands of years, its stability has been an advantage, and it's flourished as a means of communication. All this time, technology has been advancing at a pedestrian rate. But then suddenly in the 21st century, that pedestrian gets on an intercontinental jet plane. Now our world is just advancing so fast, and poetry can't keep up. Its stability was once an advantage, but now it's just stubborn traditionalism. If it stays the way it is, it's not going to be relevant anymore. There's a neat editorial on the Washington Post called "Is Poetry Dead?" I'm going to link it in the doobly-doo. It says this: poetry has gone from being something that you did in order to write your name large across the sky and sound your barbaric yawp and generally shake things up to a very gated medium that requires years of study and apprenticeship in order to produce meticulous, perfect golden lines that up to 10 people will ever voluntarily read. This is pretty grim, but I think it's pretty accurate as well. So I'll connect some dots here. Approaches to learning poetry have thus far been very structuralist in nature. It's usually presented as an elevated old media art form. At its center is this idea that old media and new media are inherently different. Poetry should not mix with new media. New media is too young and unproven. Old media is what scholars and academics study because it's got history. Now, I don't disagree. Poetry's got some incredible history, and that needs to be recognized. But that central idea that old and new are inherently different is very problematic. This is because the new media around us is post-structural in nature. It's constantly changing and adapting because it has no center. It doesn't discriminate between art forms. It takes in everything it possibly can. Bottom line, new media is keeping up with our fast-paced world. Old media is not. Poetry needs to follow in the steps of new media. We need to abandon this idea that the old and new are somehow different. We have to adopt a post-structuralist approach to understanding and learning poetry. We have to blur the lines between poetry and Twitter, poetry and vlogging, poetry and television. So why did I compare poetry and vlogging? So that I can blur these lines. By doing this, I can start a discussion, discourse on the similarities between old and new. And why did I use a vlog form to make my argument in the first place? Well, first of all, it would be all meta and really cool, but also to demonstrate this idea itself. Vlogging and academia don't need to be separated. But before I go on, let me clarify one thing. Now, I know post-structuralism is used within poetry and it's used to analyze poetry all the time. But the post-structuralism I'm talking about isn't within the poetry. I'm talking about a broader, epistemological post-structuralism that deals with our understanding of new media versus old media. The second big question I want to tackle today is this. If it's so necessary for poetry to adapt to new media, how are we going to make that happen? I mean, everything I've been talking about up to this point has been pretty abstract and philosophical, so what's something tangible that I can do? First, we can actively inject old media into new media. Now, I know from my classmates in English 410 this isn't really a new idea, we've already been doing this actively. But this helps a lot because this is going to help undo all the negative stigma that there is around old media, so keep at it. Secondly, why don't we continue this initiative beyond English 410? Why not in our other classes? Just because you don't get credit for tweeting about your post-colonial class doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Or even better, why don't we continue these initiatives beyond just this one semester? I personally really enjoy making these vlogs. If possible, I'd love to continue after the semester ends. I've noticed that YouTube is chock full of educational vlogs, but there's very little in the way of literature or even the humanities. The majority of vlogs out there are in the sciences, which kind of sucks. I'd love to explore this market some more and try to get a literature-based vlog out there. Third, let's take advantage of this social media community that we've already established. Over the summer, I expect to do a ton of reading just for fun, but reading has always been such a private activity. During the summer, I think it might be a cool idea to talk about whatever we're reading, maybe over Twitter or the Facebook group. Maybe, relate our readings to what we talked about in class, or even recommend some good books. Number 4, why don't we actually present poetry through new media? There are tons of blogs out there of poets just putting their work out on the internet. But why don't we try that with vlogs? Because slam poetry and spoken word is getting pretty big nowadays. It'd be pretty cool to see video poetry becoming more and more mainstream. Alright, so if you've kept up with me throughout my entire essay, way to go you. Now I'm going to try to conclude and summarize as best as I can. My argument started with me comparing Elizabethan poetry and vlogging in terms of form and function, and I did that in my first 2 videos. Today, I've argued that unless we adapt our understanding and approach to poetry, then it's going to become irrelevant. But my earlier juxtaposition shows that it's not totally outlandish to think that poetry and new media are compatible. And finally, I've left you with some ideas on how we can tangibly implement poetry into the new media world. So, thank you for sticking with me, you guys. If you've got any suggestions, especially ideas where we can combine poetry and new media, then please leave a comment. If there's some good discussion on this video, I'd love to respond to it in a follow-up video, so maybe there's going to be a part 4 someday. I hope you've enjoyed my poetic adventure, and I'll see you guys all in class.